Well, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all so bright and early today. Looking forward to this presentation. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Aboriginal people. And it's just a real honour to be able to host this event with WBCIL. I think these two need no introduction, so I'll attempt, but I'm sure you're much more well known by this group than I'll be able to cover. Shane, we've worked together for many, many years as you've been in Indigenous higher education, as a teacher, as a course designer, working in ethics, supervising students, advising in educational policy. Now, there's not really an area of Indigenous education that you haven't been involved in. That's right. So I think it's just wonderful to have you here being involved in this work and to hear your voice and thoughts about where we're going in Indigenous education. And I think the opportunity from HET to support this work, to hear that voice, is incredibly valuable. And Kat has been working in both public health as well as education sectors. You've been involved in the HET programs, but I know that your work in health extends way beyond and internationally as well. I think you've done some work in places like Bangladesh, haven't you? Yes. So I think the two of you bring quite different perspectives to thinking about where we've travelled from and where we might go. And I think, well, from who's turned up, I think it's a pretty good sign that it's of high interest for our future. So I'm going to hand over and we'll look forward to hearing your thoughts from your work in this area and your evaluation. Thank you very much.
For those who don't know me, my name is Shane Motlap. Just had a talk with some pastoral people this morning and they're still trying to call me Motlap. So. Anyway, it goes on. As Ruth says, I've been around for a little while. Started here in '93, just as a part-time lecturer. And I still have my original contract on my wall. It's $26,000. I hit the big time. And then after 18 months of doing that, just teaching as a casual lecturer. Hey, George. I got offered, I competed for a position of permanent lecturers, but it became a course coordinator role, which meant, Ruth mentioned course design. That was essentially 30% of my job, was to write up a new course. It was the equivalent of year 10. But it was designed for adult Aboriginal people here in the territory. So that's what I did, and I delivered that and recruited to that and did the whole lot from scratch. And then, because the course went so well and the students enjoyed it so much, and the opportunities and that it framed, opportunities like Mandatory employment and door openers, someone wanted to go on and do their Year 12 equivalent, so I had to sit down again, scratch out a course design for that, resource it, find the staffing for it. One of the staff just walked in. Hey, George. George is still here. George was one of the original staff members. We didn't have an Aboriginal scientist that we could draw on at the time. George got the job. Okay. And we're still here, George. Yeah, we've managed to duck under the radar long enough of the senior managers. So that's us in a nutshell. Now, one for about 30 years, so that's 93 to now. One of the things that interests me in my current position is policy, and all sorts of levels of policy and how they impact on Aboriginal people and their ability to do things in terms of what can you access. You know, it's not so much as having access, it's about what is it that you want to access. So we got some money together. We put together this project. It is a bit of a history project in a sense, because it goes back over the years about policy at the federal level, but how did the NT governments respond to that? So you're stealing a little bit of your thunder here, okay? But how did the successive governments respond to that, to each successful policy from the federal level? And then how did that play out here in higher ed between two institutes? Okay. So we've disregarded all the other players here in the territory, like our next door neighbours over here, over at ANU. So we've disregarded that in this project for now. But we already know that there's a number of players here in the territory doing different things, so we should be cognizant of that as well. Is there anything else? Oh, yeah, and the thanks, yeah. And the thanks. So I'm the chair of the reference group for the project. Thanks to some of the members in my reference group. My project team is here. My reference group is not here. Okay. That's all right. We shall name them later. Oh, Tracy's here. Margaret. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So there's two there. Anti-Ed department. No?
And Robin.
And Robin. Yes. Thank you, Robin. Talking about country. Let me wind back a bit. Acknowledgements to Larrakia people. Thank you. And I'm just talking to Robin yesterday about our country back home, what did we return from our country, and we're still going to catch up and go over that and talk about some views and business work. Is there anything else? All right, I'll make myself a cup of tea and be quiet. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Shane. So thank you everyone for showing up. It's a really great turnout and I'm really happy to be here to be able to report on the work that I've been working on for the last 9 months. I hope that you'll be able to take something from it. And I would also, as Shane said, like to acknowledge the hard work of the reference group and the project team because I still consider myself far from being an expert on any of this and it's really been their support and guidance that's made us able to bring this all together. So thank you. As Ruth mentioned, the project was funded through Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program, which is an Australian government program, so thank you for the funding provided by them. The aims of this project were really to explore Indigenous perspectives of success in higher education. So if we're thinking about policy and its effectiveness, success is defined as achieving an aim or purpose. And policies are obviously designed to achieve a particular purpose. So we wanted to explore from as far back as when Aboriginal people were included in higher education policy, what were the aims of Indigenous education back then? How have they changed? And what do Indigenous people who have experience in the higher education sector now, in their time of looking back at what they've seen change, how do they define success? And can we find any relationships in terms of student outcomes, enrolment and completion outcomes? So I'm going to talk through the 3 parts to this project. The first was the policy review, second was the quantitative data that we obtained, and the third was the interviews. And so I should also mention that Bachelor was a partner in this project, so thank you very much to particularly John Gunther and Robin Oda's work in this, in collecting and analysing the data. Alright, it's the first time I'm using this Prezi thing, so we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to talk to you just very briefly, decade by decade, the major sort of policy approaches and what the past iterations of Charles Darwin University and Bachelor Institute were doing in response to those policies and policy approaches. And it's going to be really quick because I've got a lot to get through, so excuse me for that. And another thing I'll say is that we will be publishing a final report and also a few publications. So if you're interested in getting a copy of those, please feel free to come up to me afterwards and I'll take your email down. So in the 1960s, it was still assimilation policy that was formalised. That was the approach to education. So the purpose of education as perceived by the Australian government was to assimilate Aboriginal people, basically breed Aboriginal culture out. And we saw that there was a lot of movement happening, in fact, internationally around civil rights and human rights, and that filtered through to Australia very strongly. There were lots of Aboriginal rights activists active at that time, and therefore eventually we saw assimilation policy be abandoned at the end of the 1960s. And around this time it was also when Aboriginal people were included within education policy formally, and that came in the form of Ad Study. There were 2 adult education centres set up, one in Alice Springs and one in Darwin, and they basically eventually became cdu, and they were set up in response to the growing population of the territory. There was also an annex set up at Camilda College, which was the very start of Bachelor Institute as it exists now, and that was the focus there was in training of Aboriginal teachers with acknowledgement of the rights that they had in education. So over to the 70s, Whitman came in 1972, and the approach changed relatively sharply, I guess. So it was all about self-determination in this point in time. So a lot of things going on in terms of land rights, in terms of training of Aboriginal teachers, acknowledging that Aboriginal people according to self-determination policy, that they should play a big role in education of their own people. And Darwin Community College, as it was then, so that was what the old adult education centre became in Darwin, and ATEC or Bachelor College as it became in the early 70s, when it moved out to Bachelor. Both of those institutions set up programs around training for Aboriginal teachers. Excuse me, I'll probably look at my notes a little bit. And most significantly, well, quite significantly with Bachelor, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the RATE program, the Remote Aboriginal Teacher Education Program, which was delivered quite in a manner that was quite strongly in partnership with remote communities, and it was delivered on site in remote communities. In the 19... there we go. In the 1980s, things changed, sort of honing in on trying to increase access and participation for Indigenous people in higher education. So there was some equal opportunity legislation that came out, as well as I should mention as well, in the 1970s, underneath self-determination policy, a really big part of that was setting up of Aboriginal consultative groups, so such as the National Aboriginal Education Committee, which was a national body of Aboriginal representatives from around the states and territories, and there were also representatives who had expertise from all along the education continuum, so from early childhood right through to tertiary education, and they would come together regularly to meet and discuss, and they also had control over funding structures. And within the Northern Territory in the 70s as well, there was FEPI. So FEPI was the territory-based Aboriginal Education Consultative Group. So they sort of played a similar role, except that they sat with government. In response to access and participation, there was a lot happening with both Darwin Community College, or Darwin Institute of Technology as it became, and Bachelor College. So things like student support started increasing. They set up what were called enclaves, which was essentially an area of the university for Indigenous students that would be there to provide support for students as they needed it. And really injections of funding from the federal level through to the Northern Territory institutions to enable that to happen. A key report that sort of was the start of the deregulation measures that we've sort of seen happen over a few decades. The Dawkins report was released in, I think, 88, and that was recognising that the participation rates across Australia's population were increasing quite dramatically, and that the public sector was not going to be able to support that by itself in an ongoing way, and therefore aimed to put some of the burden for costs for courses onto individuals. So in the 1990s, we saw, so this is really when some of the deregulation process started to happen. So essentially they made it more competitive between institutions, and therefore that incentivised higher education institutions to start measuring their performance and trying to be more competitive in that space. And we can really see in bachelor's and Northern Territory universities, as it was then, that it's in the 90s that they start actually measuring and reporting against indicators. Hopefully you picked up the pattern that the blue circle is old CDUs and the orange circle is old bachelor. Should have mentioned that. In the 2000s, in response to this I guess, focus on performance. People, as I said, there was more need to measure outcomes and to be accountable. And therefore, Charles Darwin University and Bachelor, we sort of see, when John and I were looking through the old documents, we sort of, from this point in time onwards, we found it quite difficult to draw links between what was happening at these institutions and national policies, because it's sort of, well, we've sort of postulated that in the 1990s, when these measures came in, the institutions were forced to be more focused on their, things like finances and keeping themselves in the green, rather than actually investing in Indigenous education, doing that in a strategic way. See, there were things like Charles Darwin University really started to ramp up their focus on international students around this time, so increasing access to a wider range of students, of course, to bring in revenue. Bachelor Institute also went through some financial troubles in the late 2000s, and then the Asiki partnership, of course, was announced in the late 2000s, which was probably one of the most significant things happening for them. But in the meantime, of course, they had been expanding their programs too. They got some bachelor degrees going as well as higher degree by research. And they had also branched outside of the education sphere as well. So they were delivering courses around health and community services, things like that. So the emphasis on outcomes and accountability continues throughout this decade. And we've seen with things like Closing the Gap, where it's really, you can see that sort of discourse coming through. And the same things continue with Charles Darwin University and Bachelor. It's sort of hard to, clearly follow where they're drawn with their strategies from. The other thing that has happened nationally, particularly in recent times, is that, particularly with governments like Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, who really emphasise personal responsibility and learning, and they also they quite blatantly state that their interest in the economy, building the workforce, things like that. So if you look on the Australian government's website around higher education, it talks about the aims of higher education being towards strengthening the economy, building trade, things that are around, finance and the economy. And another thing that's happened in the NT, notably, is the two sort of most recent policy initiatives that we've seen happen were the Wilson Review in 2014 and the NT government's response to that. And they're considered to have taken sort of in comparison to some of the earlier reviews that happened in the Northern Territory. So there was Harris in 1990 and then Collins in 1999. And those two reviews of education were considered to take quite a consultative approach to listening to the needs of Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people. Whereas Wilson was done quite quickly and considered to not have consulted in a very sort of comprehensive way. Just realised something else I should have mentioned at the beginning was that another thing that became quite clear as we were looking at these policies is that really a lot of the policy that has been targeted towards Aboriginal people, at least in the Territory, has been focused towards remote Aboriginal people. So really became quite clear that it was a gap in policy and in what is documented as to what was actually happening for Aboriginal people in urban centres like Darwin and Alice Springs. Again, sorry for skipping through this quite quickly. Oh no. There we go. Okay, so that's the policy review in brief. We pulled some student data, and thank you to Penny Sidiat and Fiona Shelley here at CDU and Aki Kakeha over at Bachelor for providing their assistance with this. One of the main things to take from this is that prior to the 2000s, or the early 2000s I should say, it was really hard to sort of get hold of any consistent data. I did have a slide in there that showed just how patchy the data was that we've been able to pull from both CDU and Bachelor. annual reports. It's just all over the shop, and so you can't really take anything from it apart from the fact that it's really inconsistent. And then we did have a look at data after the early 2000s. Just something to be aware of, as probably most of you know, the Indigenous student cohort at both CDU and Bachelor is largely mature age, so it's just something to be aware of when we're looking at those enrolment versus completion numbers. Enrolments are quite big, completions are quite small numbers, not saying that accounts for all of that, but just to be aware of that. Because obviously mature age students, they'll often be working or study part-time, they might dip in and out, do a few units and then have a break and then go back in, so it just takes longer to complete. We did have a few different data sets, again because we don't have much time. I've just pulled out a couple of things to look at. So this is, I'm going to have on the left CDU and on the right Bachelor, enrolments at the top, completions at the bottom. For those of you who don't know, the ASICI partnership, when that was established, it was, the agreement was that higher education courses that weren't higher degrees by research would be delivered through CDU. So a lot of the students came, well, all of the students who were studying higher degrees by coursework courses came over to CDU, just to clarify that. And we can see that quite clearly come out in these graphs, so I'm sorry I don't have a pointer. But on the left, if we look at CDU first, you can see this big increase. That's when students came over from Bachelor, and then a few years later we see a peak in the completion, so some of those students were starting to complete. And then similarly over at Fight, quite suddenly, so the Bachelor, the CDU partnership was announced in 2009, and then so from that point onwards, if there were students who wanted to enroll, they'd come over to CDU. And so these tiny little numbers here, that's the remaining high degree by research course students that were studying with Bachelor. Bachelor also continues to play a really strong role in the vet space, just by the way. That thing there is a bit of an administrative anomaly, I guess. Anomaly, but an outlier, so don't pay too much attention to that. But I guess one of the main things that we can see from here is the difference in gender, which is quite interesting, sort of not central to the findings of this project, but particularly with CDU, you can see a difference here, that there's, back in 2001, there was probably one male to two females. Sorry, orange is male, by the way, and blue is females. And then back over here at 2017, it's increased probably about almost 3 to 1. So perhaps an area for some further research, but interesting thing to note. The other really important set of data that we looked at was that broke it down by field of education. So again, I think it's probably more accentuated in Charles Darwin University's data. I'm not exactly sure why, but so this has broken it down by health in the blue, education in the orange, and society and culture in the grey. So I'm sorry, you probably can't see that, it's probably hard to read, but the basic things to see are that they don't follow a clear trend. So if Indigenous higher education was, you know, obviously policy is very complex, but we can't sort of draw any clear links between Indigenous higher education broadly and what was happening with the data, because they would sort of follow more closely, mirror what was happening in the different schools. But actually what's happening is that if we look at health, for example, sort of trending upwards in the blue there, trending upwards, even since ASICI, whereas education in the orange spiked when ASICI was set up, but then started to decline in terms of enrolments getting completions, so a bit all over the shop. Same with society and culture. So that's student outcomes. We'll move on to the interviews now. So as I said, success is around determining whether you've achieved something. So we really wanted to explore what our informers saw as being a success. What were their motivations for taking part in higher education? Why did they see it as being important? So I've included a few quotes in these, so I'll probably just give you a moment to read through them, and then I'll just make a few comments. So the first thing to note from this, as Wendy says at the top there, was, and a number of people commented on this, was the really important and central role that Aboriginal people have played to shaping higher education as it exists now. That came out very, very strongly, and that in fact the purpose of higher education was to enable people to continue to play those leadership roles. And then just in relation to those next three quotes, probably the other really important thing that came out was that perceptions around why people participate in higher education seem to be really embedded in community interests. So it was around taking that collective sort of view of, well, we're doing this to make things better for our community or to sort of improve social outcomes, community development, that kind of thing. In terms of measuring success, sort of relatively consistent with what policy often defines these days in terms of completing units, completing courses. And then the last three quotes here are around representation, whether that be in the student body or whether that be in the workforce, in education or more broadly in other sectors. Included, there was so much in there, and I really just tried to include a few of the sort of key points, so apologies that I'm not going into a whole lot of detail here, but again, I'll give you a few moments to read over those quotes. Read them. So these were some of the sort of, I guess, underlying key principles that people saw as being really important to effective policy implementation. So Esther at the top there was involved, Esther J. Lunga out at Goombulanya was involved in the Collins Review, and she really felt that she had a good understanding around how it was working and what the purpose of it was and what the outcomes would be. Whereas she, we asked her about the Wilson Review, and she just quite openly said, I don't know what the Wilson Review did, she had no knowledge of it. Innovation, so trying something new. Steve was talking about when he was appointed to being the first Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Leadership. That was the first time someone an Indigenous person had been appointed at such a senior level across the country, and as a result we've seen quite a lot of other positions get established in recognition of the importance of the need for executive and leadership positions. And Robin Hughes talking about the need for it to be valued, the benefits that having Aboriginal people more strongly involved in education, employment in society, Western society in general, the value that brings, and the value of diversity. And another really strong one was political will. So you can have a policy coming from the national level, but unless you've got that support at the institutional level, someone who's going to drive that, someone with power, then it's just a document. So I think these are some of the, particularly at the top here, probably some of the really fundamental things that I'll talk a bit more about later. Again, sorry, a few moments to read those. So I'll touch briefly just on the bottom two first, actually. There were many things around the political cycles and the things that are present that prevent success in higher education or effective policy implementation. So, you know, chop change approaches, every time a different government comes in, it changes, and then, you know, relationships get affected, and there's no time to demonstrate change, all that kind of thing. And the other thing that talks about here is how this focus on accountability has sort of led to quite a narrow range of measures often being used to measure progress and success. And that's just sort of a couple of snippets. There was many, many things mentioned. But I guess I wanted to focus on the more theoretical and philosophical underlying principles of where people saw the issues were. And they were really around, so Gary talks here, and Wendy talks a lot about it as well. It's just the historically sort of paternalistic approach that you probably all know about. Non-Indigenous people basically saying that they know best for Indigenous people. And we've seen that gradually change. I probably didn't talk through that enough with the policy review, but over time we have seen a disbandment of a number of consultative bodies that have been set up underneath this self-determination approach, gradual disbanding of them over time, and therefore essentially less Indigenous ownership and control over the way that policies are devised and how they're evaluated. And Bob makes a couple of really good quotes, and that's one of them. I think if the system is fundamentally flawed, then people end up fitting in and not being agents of change. And it's also led to the sort of closing the gap discourse that we see now, as I mentioned before, where it's very much framed in deficit, failure, whereas Aboriginal people see themselves being as resilient agents of change, who have persevered no matter what. They just keep going, and policies just sort of definitely represents the problem in a different way. So when I use that term problem, I guess I'm referring to, John sort of got me onto a book. It's called Post-Structural Policy Analysis by Batchy and Goodwin, and it talks about policies. So they put forward a model, and it's called What is the Problem Presented to Be? And so therefore you're thinking about the viewpoints and worldviews of who is creating these policies in the first place. Where do they see the problems to be? So if Aboriginal people aren't having input into that, then of course we're going to see policies as they exist now that is not necessarily reflective of Aboriginal needs and priorities and aspirations. Perceptions of change. Give me a moment there. So there were some positive observations around positive change, what's happened. So Yvonne was talking about the new generation of graduates that are coming through that are really politically savvy and have a really sophisticated worldview, more sort of options in terms of study. Steve comments on the more positions at senior executive level. So there definitely were some perceptions of success in terms of how things have changed over time. But really, generally speaking, across most of the key informants that we interviewed, there was a real sense of just frustration, being over it, just, you know, concern for how things have changed in terms of not feeling included in the policy process, not feeling like there's that sense of ownership anymore. So I'll just give you a talk over that. So I don't want to finish on just being all doom and gloom by any means. So I'll comment on, I guess, some of the key findings, but also the opportunities that we see. So we're still, just to make a note that we're still finalising this. So I won't give you recommendations today, but just sort of to summarise the key findings. they're really, so when we think about what I talked through with the policy review, how the aims of education and higher education have changed. So going from that self-determination approach through to equity and participation and access in the sort of 80s and 90s, and now focusing on outcomes and institutions being accountable, and really with that big emphasis on workforce jobs from the Australian government that we're seeing right now, where people that we interviewed and the reference group as well sort of very much view education as a way of making things better for communities and improving outcomes for their own people. It's, like I said, clear that there was inconsistent approaches to data collection and use, and probably quite topical because there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment around Indigenous, not only Indigenous ownership over policy, but also over data. So how is data conceptualized, and what do people see? Where is the need to collect data? What are you actually looking at? What's the problem from your point of view, and what data are you going to collect to measure that, and how are you going to use it as well? So that whole argument around data sovereignty. The third thing that we're seeing come out is the impacts of deregulation. So just to highlight again that it was really clear that cdu and Bachelor, since this big focus on since the deregulation measures started in the 90s, that cdu and Bachelor have been struggling a little bit to follow what's happening in terms of national policy. So again, the policies are there, but in terms of how they actually bring that into their own strategies, they're a bit constrained in terms of how much they can invest in that space, because they're very concerned about financially where the institution is going and making sure that they stay afloat. But just to sort of summarise in a positive way, we've shown through this project that there's so many well-skilled people with lots and lots of expertise spanning back decades within the territory by itself. And so I think recommendations will be around making sure that there is ownership over the policy process. And I mean, I know it's not new, but I think looking back so far, it sort of, I think, summarises things quite nicely to be able to see how things have changed and really emphasise that there needs to be that sense of ownership and control, as well as the philosophical ideas around that. So people being able to recognise where they see things should go and have ownership over those decisions. And there's, and even nationally, there's heaps of Indigenous scholars and academics and leaders, educators, people who have very, well known and have huge expertise. And again, people like Peter Buckskin, Lester Rigney, and Eileen Morton Robinson. There's so many people who are there and who are ready and willing to participate in these projects. And I like that quote again by Bob Darwin, just to finalise things there. So that's really about it.
Okay. For all the people in the room, you know that this is only a very quick, very brief summary. The amount of data, research, effort, just people hours devoted to just bring you this snippet is phenomenal, and that goes for CDU and BITE in that collaboration. There's heaps of things there that you all can relate to, either when you first started in the sector or even today. When I said this was a history project, I mean that in the context of the current higher ed reforms that are happening at the moment. I was just having a coffee shop conversation about, just to lead in while you think up the questions, having a coffee shop conversation just before coming here about our federal government trying to lift our international rankings, mainly OECD rankings. And when they say economic, to improve the economy through its education, infrastructure and output is to skill up the workforce. That's all that means. It's very simple. But we have 39 universities in the sector, plus White, which makes it 40. We have a very small population, only 24 million. What's the population of Indigenous Australians, Fiona? Had a rough guess. 750,000, yeah, at last count. If you took that conservative number, and we talked about the amount of, say, scholars, Indigenous or Aboriginal scholars that are currently around. Kim, you showed me an article about the 400 plus PhDs, Aboriginal PhDs in the country right now. What year was the article though? 2016? 2015? No, it was older than that. 2012. 2012. So that was at 2012. We're at 2018 now, so 7 and a bit years later, no, 6 and a bit years later. That hasn't counted the people who are in the pipeline in terms of honours, masters and PhD candidates. That's 400 plus back then, PhDs. If we get to 750 PhDs, that's 1% of the population. That's pretty good. I saw some encouraging numbers. Is my maths correct? Yeah. I see some nodding. Yeah, thank you for checking. Yeah, my maths is my strongest point, by the way. But if you check the Pertinent review report, it has specific numbers in it as well. So that number is higher. That's a more recent number that you can refer to. How was that? 2015? Was that 2012 as well?
Yeah, it was 2012.
Oh, look at the article.
You update something.
I have to update myself. So those are some of the current numbers that you can have a look at the moment while you're thinking about what is the status of the higher education system. There are cultural aspects about, particularly the Bob Morgan quote about the system itself, if it's already faulty. I don't think the Australian higher education system is faulty, I just don't think it caters for Aboriginal people. If you're talking about an accommodation model for an education system.
Well, that doesn't make it faulty.
No, that's the point.
For the whole population.
That's the point.
All of us.
That's the point.
Apparently are Australian, so, you know, cater for everyone.
Interesting, because the other half of the conversation I had here was to balance what the federal government want to do in terms of lifting its international rankings against another argument, either by the opposition or in the UK, about broadening access and equity, and to balance the two. Some people see that as mutually exclusive. I don't think so in terms of this space, because my argument was that you have to broaden the access in order to just lift the rankings, the educational rankings of Aboriginal people in this country, let alone international rankings. I'm not interested in that at the moment. There's a big enough job here to do in this country, just with this group of people. 750,000. Anyway, that's my 2 cents chucked in there. Yes?
Do we have questions?
Of course you can, yeah. I was only talking to fill the gap while you were thinking of questions, yes.
So thanks very much for a very interesting
that's all
talk.
Cat's work, not mine.
It's really Cat's cat. Towards the end you talked about the disparity in perceived purpose of higher education. And I think I understood that in terms of local expectations around community development versus national expectations around building the workforce or the economy. But I expected you to talk instead about, say, people who I know in country, their problem is that higher education is not taking place in an accessible location. In Darwin, there's a problem for Indigenous people to be in Darwin. There's all sorts of social issues here. So it's about the process rather than the ends. That's where I experienced the disparity. Whereas when you talk about the difference between community development and building the workforce, well, that's pretty close. It's not a big, I don't view that as a big disparity compared to this disparity in process versus outcomes.
Well, the project team can respond. Any member of the project as well. All right.
Oh, don't know if I'm well qualified to answer, but what you've just asked to me when you're talking about that process stuff, I almost see that as a bit different to the aims of why people participate in education, like where they see the benefit coming to themselves or to their communities. Is that like, because I would almost see that as being more closely aligned with the enables or barriers to policy implementation, like what's actually set up to enable people to participate in education. Higher ed.
I guess I was trying to get at the concept or the purpose of higher ed. That seems to me more a locus for disparity.
It depends on, well, I'll come to Wendy in a minute, but it depends on, for me, how you measure it. Right. Wendy?
Yeah, my name's Wendy Ludwig. I'm one of the people that was on the reference group for this project. In response to your comment, one of the really obvious things that came out of this whole process was the fact that Aboriginal affairs operates within a total policy vacuum. And so if over the period from the 70s through to now, if you were to have a look at where the most prolific success happened for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around this country was in the 70s and 80s, where you had really strong policy that was driving change that then obviously was picked up and followed through and interpreted and pushed within states and territories around the country. Inside of those activities, we had the largest numbers of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory graduating with, teaching qualifications, other undergraduate degrees, what have you. And it was within that context of a really strong policy framework, plus the investment of dollars to actually enable that to happen. And the ways that underpinned those activities looked at different delivery methodologies that were flexible, that were able to cater to people living and studying in their own communities, working, etc., etc. Now, if you have a look at what's happening now, the investment in supporting flexible delivery platforms that are customised to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been thrown out of the door. And, the arguments around, economy of scales and accountabilities around, value for investment and all of those kinds of issues become more predominant. And, it's a known fact that delivering education and training services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, regardless of location, is a more expensive business than it is for, a group of 20 people sitting in a classroom in Darwin. And that's a reality, because of all the wraparound services and support, as well as different delivery methodologies, teaching materials, learning materials, etc. So, whilst on the one hand, I understand what you're saying, the reality is that the whole sector is at, being held ransom or at the mercy of a lack of investment, full stop. Plus, the lack of, an overall policy framework that's actually driving the agenda and driving what it is that we actually do.
I think it's kind of related to that comment, but I just think that it's interesting, and I wonder whether any of the work or the research that you did, because I know that it was driven from a policy perspective, but the irony being kind of reading the people who were making all the comments and who you interviewed and everything, they were the recipients of some of that policy implemented in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that has now started to dwindle, and because of economic rationalisation, a whole range of other constraints don't currently exist. But whether or not you actually did any mapping to the qualifications and obviously the academic quals that all of the people that you actually engaged in the process, and what era or what period of policy they were actually the benefactors of, versus what we're looking at in reality now for our students and the dearth of all of those opportunities, not only as higher ed, but also and also secondary school students and whatnot, because even I in the 20s was the benefactor of the quotas that were set on higher ed institutions to attract Indigenous students, which even don't exist now for our own institutions.
Certainly out of this review, we found we came across a whole heap of additional areas that require more work. And one of those is that exactly what you're talking about now, is tracking people and doing kind of profiles of people, that have been the recipients or the beneficiaries of the work that's gone before and where they're now. And again, it comes back to, we've got all this pool of expertise and, experience and insights and energy, and again, lack of policy framework to actually drive the agenda. And, that's some of the stuff that's come out of the key findings, is some of the recommendations that have been going to come out of it around some coordination.
Okay. The short answer to that, and I'll respond to both. We have this much money, and we have this much time. Yeah. So that's
story.
But for Wendy's response to yours, there's easily about 10 PhDs in terms of further research projects. So that's one of the outcomes we want from the project, is about further research in terms of their recommendations. And you yourselves can pick out points that interest you and that you will follow up on if you're going to do a research project. So that's like, trying to tick the box on any good research project, that it should generate more research. It should generate more questions, more inquiry in terms of our Western scientific frameworks.
It's a good point though, Shell. When we were coming up with the list of key informants, it was the decision of the reference group collectively to invite people to be involved who had that sort of length of expertise over time and who had seen things change. But it's certainly something that we could have looked into a bit more, or perhaps highlighted that we need to look more into or perhaps do a similar thing.
The interviews are about the lived experience of those people. That's one of the highlights for me. That's what makes it so interesting for me, is to talk to people who've been through it. Because by the time I come through high school, went off and became a cowboy, then wanted to do teaching, then started here, still a cowboy, but did some teaching here. I'm on the tail end of all of those. What do you say? What do you call the period of time when you think it's the best time of your life? The good old days. The good old days when, Wendy has her own. Well, I'm keeping it professional. But I came in on the tail end of that because I came here in '89. '89 when it was fresh NTU. So my first qualifications are from NTU. I'm really proud of that. I still got that on my testimonials. I keep that there. But by '96, with the election of Howard, the whole world changed. You see, there was still some leftover baggage effect, good baggage effect from the 80s into the early 90s. And then big, massive policy changes, higher education. First thing Howard did, amendments to that type. So everybody, if you're Aboriginal, touch it on. Your focus is not on education and health, it's straight back to native title. So you skip that, you put that to one side. It's not as important anymore in terms of people's perspective, what they want to achieve in life, what highlights that. So that's interesting. The other thing for me, the big criticism of universities, too slow to react. Too slow, in the policy area especially. Federal government makes policy change, takes us ages to get our heads around it and to figure out what it means for our university. And we're one of the smallest universities in the country. We're still doing EBA stuff, hasn't taken policy. Hopefully we'll stick it up soon. Any further questions? I know you've got them. Shut up for it today.
Can I just make a comment?
No, I mean, I think it was really interesting, and I thought, I mean, it's really alarming, the lack of connection to policy. That's what I would probably take away from, you know, that universities have been kind of functioning without any clear or obvious direction of policy is really concerning, and yeah, particularly considering how optimistic people were back in the 70s and 80s thinking about the futures for Indigenous education. So it's really sad to see that seems to have completely dissipated. So, but it was really interesting talk. Thank you.
I was just going to ask whether there was a thought, whether there was a kind of, again, non-Indigenous politics thinking that assimilation had taken place and now there doesn't need to be an individual focus and everyone can just go under the same group banner. Is that part of perhaps where the government policy fell over and doesn't comprehend that, and that needs to be kind of, this is where this strengths will point back and say it can't be this one sort of beige policy on education that suits everybody.
Does anybody else want to have a shot?
Yeah. I reckon this is very obviously telling everyone else who's non-Indigenous, who has a key role in writing policy, that they haven't got it right yet.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not right yet. And I don't think it's a negative report or review at all. I think it's a very strong statement about what Indigenous people think about the state of higher education at the moment. How far it is perceived to have come and how far it really has or hasn't come. I think it's quite a strong statement, and I think it's important that things like this get presented in a way that shows exactly how and what Indigenous people think should happen in education. You know, it's not right, is it? Obviously. And I think it says something about engagement as well. Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, are having a protest, a silent protest. They're not engaging. When is someone going to notice and think that it has to do something about the thing, you know? Like, what the hell? Sorry.
That's okay. You can find the pitchforks outside the door.
Can I just make a couple of comments? I think that, you know, I tend to be a little bit cynical and what have you, that I actually think that the assimilation policy has never gone away. No. And by an unwritten and public kind of intent, the assimilation policy is still there. And I think that all of the indicators that exist, the lack of the policy framework, a national voice, etc., is all about treating everybody the same. And the only attention is the deficit discourse that's applied to Aboriginal people. You know, health is terrible, incarceration rates are terrible, you know, all of the break-ins and stuff at Palmerston are all black people doing that, you know, all of that stuff, and I still think that, you know, there is an agenda going down. And I think that the assimilation policy hasn't gone away and the NT government is complicit in that and still is to this day. That's my own personal view. This is not reflecting the CDU policy.
There's a sale on pitchforks, by the way.
Yes. I don't need a pitchfork. I've got my own broom. My name is Wendy. But anyway. So yeah, you know, I agree that, you know, it's still there, and I think that, you know, people are becoming tired and frustrated, and, you know, we've got a Prime Minister that knows best for us. You know, there's a whole conversation around, you know, a voice in Parliament that came out of Uluru, and the statement from Uluru around the voice in Parliament, around a representative body, change to the Constitution But our Prime Minister knows what's best for us, and he obviously knows what all of the white people in this country are thinking as well, because he's knocked on the head the idea of any kind of referendum, any kind of plebiscite, and yet we can have conversations around having a plebiscite on changing the constitution around people's eligibility to stand for parliament. You know, that's a really big issue, but obviously, you know, Indigenous affairs and what have you is not a big issue. So, you know, I think that, again, Mel, coming back to your comment, I don't think the assimilation policy is gone. You know, when you've got your Prime Minister knowing best what's right for us.
Yeah. My response to Adam is that they don't call it assimilation anymore. It just has a different name.
It's correct.
Yeah, and if you think for 1984, the novel, that is what they did. I mean, it's gone now, but there was an Australian political journal who wrote a book about use of words and how you can take good words that you think mean one thing, they actually change the meaning of that and the context of that. So they don't call it assimilation, and they might call it equity, they might call it equality, but the context of it and the way it looks very much like assimilation.
Thank you everyone for coming and listening in.